very good afternoon to all of you who joined us here in Addis for this first ever inaugural Geneva Peace Week meets Addis Ababa high-level event. My name is Solomon Ayele Durso. I'm the founding director of Amani Africa Media and Research Services, a Pan-African policy research organization that undertakes research and policy implementation support on matters relating to the African Union, with a focus on the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. It is a great pleasure for me and for us at Amani Africa to co-host this very groundbreaking high-level panel today, and the Geneva Peace Week meets Addis Ababa, which is going to be the first, but not the last, that we hope to have. More so in the light of the fast-changing global dynamics that make collaboration, cooperation profoundly more important today than ever before. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this event, excellencies, ambassadors, distinguished diplomats, civil society organization members, representatives of UN agencies present here, and those of you following us online. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I have with me a very distinguished panel that would be speaking to the theme of this high-level segment of the Geneva Peace Week meets Addis Ababa this afternoon. Africa's positioning in the evolving geopolitical landscape and the role of the African Union in fostering strategic alliances. This is the theme that we plan to discuss and reflect on with the members of the panel, along with your kind participation here from the floor, online, and of course, there are colleagues who are joining us online to speak to this subject as well. So I would like to welcome them all to this important gathering. We are witnessing profound change in the power structure of the world and in the multilateral system. Changes that have become difficult to catch up and to digest, comprehend, and prepare the necessary responses. It's not clear if the scripts that have been used until this time are still relevant and can still provide the answer for responding to the profound nature of the change that we are witnessing today. The world is also experiencing major challenges. We all know that this is an era that is experiencing the highest number of conflicts in the world since the Second World War. And this is also an era when we are witnessing major challenge to respect for and upholding of the fundamental tenets of multilateralism, the fundamental principles on which the UN and indeed international law is built. It's not simply the shifts and these challenges that we are experiencing. We are also witnessing economic instability that is affecting millions of people, billions actually, across the world. And whenever there is deep crisis of the kind that we are experiencing in the multilateral system, Africa, on account of the space that it occupies at the margin of global power, decision-making processes, it ends up being on the receiving end. So the challenge and the difficulties that all of us in the world are experiencing are felt more in parts of the world like Africa on account of various sources of vulnerabilities. And of course, Africa is not just a victim. Africa is also an actor. Africa has enormous natural resources that can provide solutions to some of the profound challenges that humanity is facing, such as the climate change crisis, for which the critical minerals that can power the transition to renewable energy are all present here on the African continent, providing a platform for collaboration, for providing global goods for global problems. And Africa constitutes 28% of the membership of the United Nations, and therefore a formidable presence in the United Nations, particularly within the context of the United Nations decision-making, the United Nations General Assembly decision-making processes. And Africa, historically, and more so today, is also a major reservoir of the principles of multilateralism that are espoused under the Constitutive Act of the African Union and subsidiary African Union instruments, which all actually uphold and profess faith in the United Nations Charter and its principles. Make reference to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is both being at the forefront of the consequences of the challenge of this moment that is felt more here in Africa and similarly positioned in parts of the world, and on account of also Africa's increasing role and potential in global governance, including through African Union's membership in the G20, that we are gathered here to discuss about and reflect on the question of Africa's positioning in this evolving geopolitical landscape and the role of the African Union in fostering strategic alliances. With that introduction, it would be my pleasure now to turn my attention to the distinguished members of this panel who would be helping us to kickstart the conversation. First, I would like to start with Ambassador Pietro Mona, the Ambassador of Switzerland to the African Union, a very dear colleague and friend of Amani Africa, and personally for me as well. It's always a pleasure to have him with us in discussions like this one. He brings a lot of great insights for collective reflection. Ambassador Mona, you have the floor, please.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, friends, it is my great pleasure to address some welcoming remarks at the beginning of the first ever Geneva Peace Week meets Addis event. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. The famous sentence written by Charles Dickens well over a century ago, in a very different context, seems nonetheless fitting for our time. A time which is characterized by polycrisis and geopolitical rivalries, by global pandemics and climate change with its devastating effects all around the world, but in particular here in Africa, the continent which has contributed the least to it, but is suffering the most. a time where we see inequalities rise and the backlash on women's rights and gender equalities, where our environment is degrading and natural resources become more and more the source of geopolitical tensions and armed conflicts. But it is also a time of great technological innovations, which could boost sustainable economic development, of women and youth organizations pushing for social change, of great generational initiatives, such as the African Continental Free Trade Area. A time where just a few months ago, our political leaders gathered in New York to adopt the Pact for the Future, not the least, thanks to the leadership of African countries pushing back on an attempt by Russia to derail the process. And so we find ourselves at a crossroad, defined by great uncertainties. Historically, governments chose either of two ways when confronted with crisis: to either retreat behind walls and nationalistic policies, or to take bold and forward-looking steps, embracing opportunities and being guided by the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. To be clear, the principal task of our political leaders is the safety and well-being of their people. So there is nothing wrong for them seeking the best for their own countries. The question is, however, how can we maintain, or rather restore, the trust in multilateralism as an instrument for countries to progress together, based on a global rule-based order, contrary to a system in which the progress of one country comes at the expense of others. One step towards the restoration of trust is honesty. Honesty about the shortcomings of the current multilateral system and its failure to adequately address the challenges of the 21st century. And so, to use the words of the UN Secretary General, the future of the system hinges on reform or rupture. What does all of this have to do with the Geneva Peace Week meets Addis event we are kicking off here today? In a disruptive moment, confronted with a multitude of global challenges, while seeking a more equitable, just, and effective multilateral system, as part of the reform process, we have to venture towards new partnerships and embrace the need to bolster the network of multilateral hubs, such as Addis Ababa and Geneva. And so our event is intended to achieve just that. A small step towards more networked multilateralism, focusing on peace and security and the aspiration of contributing to more synergies and collaboration between the two diplomatic hubs. Geneva is reaching out, knowing that for the multilateral system to regain its credibility and trust, it has to be anchored strongly in Africa and be reformed with Africa. We hope that by bringing together distinguished personalities and engaged actors from both ecosystems here at the Geneva Peace Week meets Addis, we can contribute to this endeavor, so that looking back, we can say that indeed, despite all the challenges that we are currently facing, this today was a spring of hope, another winter of despair. To conclude, let me express my gratitude to our co-organizers, the Geneva Peacebuilding platform, and our continuous partner, Amani Africa. Many thanks also to all the speakers who have agreed to be part of the event, and of course to the many, many participants who have joined us here today in person and many more online. I wish you an insightful, enriching, and inspiring 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that very defining opening remark. The question of spring of hope, a winter of despair that this moment represents, capturing Charles Dickens. The question of rupture or reform that is confronting the multilateral system. which actually echoes a title of a chapter in the high-level panel of experts on Africa and the reform of the multilateral system that we at Amani Africa had the pleasure of leading through Namibia as the champion of this process, which culminated in the report of that high-level panel. And for Africa, I think the choice, as the panel put it, is basically very clear. A chaotic world is not a world where Africa would benefit from. And therefore, what is required and needed is indeed the resetting of the multilateral system in a way that caters for the needs and interests of all, with particular attention to addressing the historical injustices suffered by Africa. Thank you so much for that. I now have the distinguished pleasure to welcome to Addis to Dr. Aniasa Balal, who is the Executive Director of the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform. The Geneva Peacebuilding Platform is a very distinguished institution based in Geneva that brings together a great deal of expertise and wealth of knowledge in order to advance Geneva International, particularly in the realm of peace building. It's really wonderful for us at Amani Africa to collaborate with you and to welcome you to Addis. Initially, when we met last year, we were not sure whether it will happen, at least, but we set the seed during my meeting with you at your office in Geneva. It's really a pleasure to see this coming through. And of course, with the strong support of the Swiss Embassy and Pietro himself. So, Anis, most welcome. Thank you very much again to you and all your team members. Thank you, Danny and everybody.
Thank you, Salama. Before I speak, we have prepared a small video for you. So perhaps could we launch it? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, dear colleagues, students, friends, and peacemakers. It's an immense pleasure to be with you today to open with my distinguished colleagues this Geneva Peace Week meets Addis Ababa. This event is the result of months of work with our dear friends of Amani Africa, the Swiss Embassy and Permanent Mission to the African Union, and the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. Many of our colleagues are following these discussions online, so welcome to you all today here. It's an important event and a timely one for many reasons, as we heard. However, before we get into the policy discussions we will have today and tomorrow, I must acknowledge that being here with you today is also a special moment for me personally. Addis Ababa is the city where I was born and where I spent the first 7 years of my life. Addis is where I learned to walk, to speak, to read, while immersed in the city's vibrant and cosmopolitan environment. I credit my time here as a child with sparking some of my passion for global affairs and peace building, but also my deep belief in the need to challenge the status quo and channel the energy of the like you find here in Addis for the common good and humankind. This is what we try to do in Geneva with the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform and our flagship project, Geneva Peace Week. For 12 years, the Peace Week has attempted to bring together the peacebuilding community in Geneva. This sounds easy, but it is not. Rather than a cohesive community, peacebuilding involves a diverse and living web of organizations who, although their activities relate to each other and often interact or overlap, tend to work in silos with their head down under both financial and operational pressure, often responding to crises and often caught between the high expectations of communities on the ground and the slowness and convolution of global policymaking. As a result, peacebuilding actors rarely have the opportunity to take a step back, to look at the bigger picture and reflect critically on how they work. This is what the Peace Week was meant to fix. Our goal is to create spaces for dialogue and critical reflection and to foster synergies, cooperation, and innovation in the face of ever-increasing challenges. But while doing this for the peacebuilding ecosystem in Geneva, this keeps us quite busy, and it would be incomplete if we only looked inward and failed to look outside of Geneva at what peacebuilding issues and discussions are elsewhere. This is why we started the series of Geneva Peace Week Meets. We started this series to better understand how the work of the Geneva-based peacebuilding ecosystem relates to that of similar ecosystems elsewhere in the world. We started in 2023 with New York as a necessary first stop on our journey, but we wanted our second stop to be in Addis. Because Addis Ababa is not only a global hub, it's also a unique regional hub on a unique continent that has singular experience and role to play in peacebuilding. Africa is indeed the youngest continent on the planet, has some of the most rapidly growing industries, large-scale reserves of natural resources, and environmental diversity. It is a continent of innovation, creativity, and desire for change. It is also an influential continent on the world stage, whether because of the work of the African Union or because of the sheer number of sovereign states, 54, making it a uniquely powerful group at the United Nations. But Africa is also one of the most affected continents by active armed conflicts, is facing some of the worst effects of climate change, and is most affected by the outrageous level of economic inequalities that our modern world has allowed to develop. In the area of peacebuilding, to face these challenges, Africa has seen a large amount of innovative initiatives driven from the ground up by local communities all across the continent. As everybody in Geneva and New York these days talk about localization and decentralization of peacebuilding, Africa has been implementing it for decades already. This is why we are delighted to be here today. We want to share some of the discussions and issues we are having in Geneva, but more importantly, we want to hear and learn from you and reflect together on how to make peace better, more efficient, but also more resilient in the face of mounting global challenges. But I also want to be clear that this event is not a box to tick. It is only the first step of a bigger attempt to open a Geneva to the world and maintain stronger connections with other global policy hubs, but also to challenge the Western-centric, top-down global world order that seems incapable of standing up to the issues we face today. Since everything needs to start somewhere, we start today with what we hope will be an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a very fruitful discussion for the coming 2 days.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anissa Belal, Executive Director of Geneva Peacebuilding Platform. The need for engagement, indeed collaboration between different multilateral hubs is very timely. I made a contribution to one of the key publications in Geneva, Geneva Policy Outlook, where I was basically echoing what you just said, where I was saying the multilateral system is northern-centric, both in terms of centers of decision, in terms of where the power lies, but also importantly, geographically speaking. So if you think of the major hubs of global institutions, you will find them all in the north, whether it is Europe, in different European capitals, and in the US. Those are the places. And one of the things that I made there is basically, if multilateralism is to be reformed, then this northern-centric locus of multilateral hubs also has to change. And one way of doing that is exactly through networked multilateralism that brings to the center and indeed brings decision-making to multilateral hubs in the south. And no better place than Addis to start that conversation with, which has a particular significance for you personally because of what you mentioned in terms of where you started off life. So most welcome to Addis. It's a pleasure for me, therefore, to transition to the Foreign Affairs Institute of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia for the making remarks. It's a pleasure for me, therefore, to welcome Jafar Badru, Executive Director of the Institute of Foreign Affairs, to deliver his remarks. You are most welcome.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. Your Excellency, Ambassador Tamara Mona, Swiss Ambassador to Ethiopia, Excellency Ambassador Petro Mona, Swiss Permanent Representative to the African Union, IGAD and UN ECA, Excellency Dr. Anissa Belal, Executive Director for the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform, Excellency Dr. Solomon Ayele Derso, of course, the Founding Director of Amani Africa and our moderator for today, distinguished panelists, guests, and ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to express my distinct honor to deliver this welcome address on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, His Excellency Dr. Gideon Timotheos. I would also like to thank the Embassy of Switzerland, the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform, and the Amani Africa for organizing this high-level plenary on such tremendously relevant and timely topic of our time. Given the complex global reality and too much uncertainty that we are confronted with today, diving deep into the implications of geopolitical challenges for peace and security in Africa couldn't have come at a better time. Hearing from distinguished scholars and experts in the field, no doubt will help facilitate exchanging views, creates better understanding, and enables exploring feasible strategies on how best Africa can navigate the heightened geopolitical rivalry that we are living in today. Hence, this opportunity availed by the institutions such as the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform through its Geneva Peace Week meets at this initiative amid so much confusion, uncertainty, and fear is very much appreciated. Excellencies, there is no doubt that the nature of international system has significantly shaped the evolution of African countries and their institutions. If history is any guide, the competition and the rivalry among major powers can have an indelible mark on the countries that are struggling to overcome their own challenges. Although Africa might have less to do with the major driving factors for superpower competitions, we have seen that it can be a battleground for a turf war with heavy cost. In my opinion, such a risk is higher today than it has ever been before. In this sense, it wouldn't be hyperbolic to state that we're indeed at the inflection point. The things that are happening today have great potential to shape what comes in the rest of the 21st century and afterwards. So the question for Africa is, first, to address its own challenge, whether it is peace and security, economic hardship, unemployment, infrastructure deficit, and among others. Second, how can Africa carefully navigate the fierce geopolitical competition, maintain balance, and avoid getting caught up in what appears to be an increasingly deadly confrontation among the superpowers? How can we minimize the risk of these tensions for further complicating our own internal challenges? What grand strategy can be adapted for Africa to build an enduring partnership, not a pawn in the superpower competition? What would be the implications of the apparent global trade war, the decline in the values of multilateralism, and tense international systems in realizing tensions in the international system, in realizing our objectives of building peaceful, integrated, and prosperous continent? It seems we may have more questions. Excellencies, for Ethiopia, while we have always been vocal about the lack of fairness and systemic challenges in the current international system, whether it is about global security architecture or international economic arrangements, there was no confusion on the implications of a lawless world, as Africa has experienced the worst cost from the destruction and exploitation of direct colonialism. The choices must always be clear. A rule-based order is better than unbridled international system where the powerfuls gain the powerful giants can advance their exclusive interests at the cost of the others. There should not be illusions that the unpredictable and escalation tension among superpowers that are confronting us today will have indeed significant impact on the agency of Africa's institutions in overcoming the continent's challenges, in resolving the peace and security issues within the continent, as well as undercutting Africa's potential contribution beyond the continent. Hence, seeking African solutions for African problems strengthening continental and subcontinental mechanisms, maintaining balance, independent policy, avoiding building rigid alliances, flexible approach, and establishing partnerships based on mutual interests are some thoughts worth considering. I am aware that these are sometimes easier said than done. But we have to stick to these principles in order to best serve our national and continental interests. The worst case scenario is what can be summed up with the famous African proverb, quote, when elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers, which we have to make every effort to avoid. We should not allow the geopolitical rivalry to exacerbate the security challenges that Africa is facing today. Therefore, charting our own course, maintaining independence, forging common voice to assert Africa's position, collaborations on transnational challenges such as climate change are very critical. Africa's role in shaping our shared future is indeed important and cannot be ignored. In conclusion, finally, I would like to once again express my appreciation for the organizers of this timely and critical event, which have very important implication for the current and future policies of African countries. And I wish everyone to have a very fruitful discussions and successful deliberations. I thank you.
Thank you so much for those very instructive insights that actually help us get very grounded perspectives from the perspective of Ethiopia as a member of the African Union, as a host of the African Union, and therefore as a multilateral hub. The question of how we in Africa should safeguard our interests and agency, while at the same time making sure that none of us and none of our situations are actually becoming entangled in this wrestling and in this tussle that's happening between big powers. And therefore, that's, age-old wisdom that you have shared with us. When the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers, and we have to make sure, as you rightly say, that we do not end up becoming a platform where that kind of fighting happens, because we indeed have experience, as you mentioned, from colonialism, but also from the Cold War. The Cold War was not cold here in Africa. It was actually a hot war. And therefore, there is ample experience for us to learn from and avoid being entangled and avoid, of course, the kind of rigid alliances that demand you to be on this side or the other side. There is always the option of being on your own side, since everybody is on his or her own side in any case, pursuing national interest. Thank you so much again. I now move to the next panel. We have colleagues here. Ambassador Natalie Jorad is here with us in person, but we also have colleagues online. I will start with the colleagues online and then come to you because of time as they are waiting for us. I will start with Patrick Osakwe, Chief Trade, Poverty and Inequalities Branch at the UN Trade and Development Agency, UNCTAD. You are most welcome, Patrick. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to hear from you. You have the floor, please.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello?
Patrick, we can hear you.
We can.
Yes, very well.
You want me to make my intervention now?
Yes, please. Kindly proceed.
Okay, thank you very much. Your Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, may I begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to contribute to this very timely and important event. I was asked to intervene in a wide spectrum of areas, so I've tried to cluster my intervention around several messages. The first message that I want to start with has to do with the link between conflict, peace, and poverty. And the point I want to make here is that if we are to achieve and maintain peace in Africa, it's essential for poverty eradication and also the attainment of the other sustainable development goals that our leaders have adopted. As you may be aware, about 40% of people who live in extreme poverty live in conflict-affected areas. And based on the recent data that has been released, about 67% of those in global extreme poverty live in Africa. So what these two facts mean or imply is that if we are to achieve the sustainable development goals, we have to pay attention to what's happening to Africa and also look at the interconnections between conflict and some of the laudable goals that we have set for ourselves. We know that insecurity has been a reoccurring problem in Africa since the 1960s, since most countries have obtained their independence. And it has had dire consequences for trade and also for development in Africa. In fact, one of the studies that I looked at indicates that in a country in conflict, it takes about, trade drops, in a country in conflict, trade drops by about 12 to 25 percentage points. That's in the first year, you know. And it takes about 25 years before the level of trade goes back to the pre-crisis situation. So that's a very serious consequence for poor developing countries. And what this means is that we really, really need to pay attention to conflicts. That's an important factor in achieving the sustainable development goal. Is by making the opportunity cost of conflicts much higher. So the incentives to go into conflicts falls. And more importantly, another channel through which trade can prevent conflicts or could help in resolving conflicts is by building trust among societies. I think Ambassador Mona did refer to this issue of trust. And I think it's very important, you know, in terms of establishing the relationship between trade and conflicts or peace building. Now, but even though trade can play a positive role in terms of crisis prevention or conflict prevention, it can also exacerbate conflicts. For example, it could provide access to the resources that are necessary or that countries need in order to finance conflicts. It could also increase competition for natural resources, which we've seen in a number of areas, and that could exacerbate not just existing conflicts, but could also increase or create new conflicts in situations where they don't exist. So the key point I'm trying to make here in terms of this link between trade and conflict is that the relationship is multidimensional. It's not one directional. And because it's multidimensional, it means we need to have a holistic approach to resolving these conflicts, especially in terms of better harnessing the potential of trade to enable us avoid and reduce conflicts. And some of the things we could do, in terms of using trade to prevent and reduce conflicts, is to ensure that trade, either directly or indirectly, addresses the root causes of the conflicts. For example, in the trading system, one of the concerns that countries have is the unfair distribution of the gains from trade. So when countries are trading and everybody's benefiting from it, it's unlikely to create tensions. But when you're trading and just a few countries are benefiting from it, that in itself is going to create tensions and lead to conflict. So one positive role that trade can play here is to make sure that it's inclusive. If it's inclusive, it's unlikely to create tensions and it's unlikely to cause conflict. So another way in which trade could be better harnessed to prevent conflicts is to ensure that it complements other peace promotion processes. For example, the governance reforms that countries have put in place in order to avoid the conflicts, and also the security measures that have been put in place by some countries in order to avoid conflicts. The point I'm making here is that trade policies have to be coherent with other policies in order for it to play a positive role in terms of reducing conflicts. And another way in which trade could play a positive role is to reduce poverty. And here the key issue is to strengthen the linkages between trade and poverty. Because what we've seen in Africa, this is really important in the case of Africa, what we've seen in Africa is that, yes, trade has the potential to trigger growth and development. But what we've seen in Africa is that a lot of countries are trading, their trade ratios are increasing, but the impact on poverty is very low relative to other regions. And that's because the benefits of trade have not been properly distributed in a way that it benefits African countries. And so one of the key issues African countries are facing in the trading system is how to strengthen linkages between trade and poverty reduction so that they could make trade work for them, just like other regions like Asia and Latin America. And there are some areas, policy actions that they need to take. One is obvious, it's the issue of diversification of economies. The second is developing productive capacities, because we don't have things to sell. Even if other countries open up their markets, the benefits are going to be very minimal. Issues of social protection to protect vulnerable groups in society, that's also very important in terms of strengthening linkages between trade and poverty reduction. Now, UNCTAD has been at the forefront of helping countries in these key areas that I mentioned. For example, we conduct research trying to identify the winners and losers in certain situations when there is trade. And this enables countries to design policies that will help them to at least compensate the losers or create some sort of mechanisms to enable the adjustment not to be as costly as it should be. We also provide support in terms of facilitating consensus on trade. So for those of you who are familiar with our Trade and Development Board, we usually have dialogues on very contentious trade issues. And this is basically to provide member states with the opportunity to dialogue on these matters and hopefully find a far-reaching solution to the concerns and issues that they're facing. Now, another issue that point that I would like to make, which is basically my second key message, is that building resilience is very important in terms of preventing and avoiding conflicts. We know that in Africa, high commodity dependence, high debt, and also weak infrastructure have increased the vulnerability of the continent to global shocks. And so this has made building resilience a very important policy priority for governments in the continent. These shocks, they cover various aspects. There are financial shocks, things like banking crisis, currency crisis. We have price shocks in the form of commodity prices. We have environmental shocks, things like natural disasters, which they're very common in Africa. And we also have conflicts, which is the focus of today's discussion. Now, in terms of policy options to build resilience in Africa, there are quite a number of them. One, which I already alluded to, is diversification. But this diversification is in three prongs. It has three aspects to it. One is diversification of production. By that I mean ensuring that we produce goods. Our production is not concentrated in just a few goods. They have to be spread across a wide range of goods so that it gives us some buffer. And when there is a shock, we can absorb it. So apart from diversification of production, there's also the need to diversify exports. A lot of African countries export commodities. And one thing we know about commodities is that, yes, they can trigger growth, but it's very difficult to sustain this growth. And so you cannot rely on commodity exports for meaningful economic development. You have to diversify into manufacturing and to some extent modern services. Now, these are products with very high income elasticities of demand and where the opportunities for export market expansion are very high. And so if you don't get into these sectors, it's very difficult to sustain any growth that you have in the economy. And then the other aspect of diversification has to do with markets. And this diversify them and also help them to build the level of competitiveness that they need to be able to access global markets. Now,
if you were able to hear us. I've been trying to draw your attention to the platform here. UNCTAD is one of the UN agencies based in Geneva, and therefore one of the reasons why we had Patrick speak about trade. Those of you online, I hope you can hear me.
I
So-
can hear you now. Yes.
Excellent. So one of the reasons why we have Patrick speak about trade and its intersection with conflict, but also the importance of regionalism, issues relating to supply chains, infrastructure, has to do with the fact that some of the institutions in Geneva are of particular significance for some of the policy implementation processes of the African Union. UNCTAD is of immediate interest for Africa with respect to the African Continental Free Trade Area and its implementation. And indeed, one of the issues that Patrick highlighted is the potential, the contribution that UNCTAD can bring to the table for advancing implementation of African Union policies. And the issues highlighted in the earlier speeches, including from Pietro, Anessa, about inequalities and its implications for today's world, and indeed it being one of the features of the challenge that we face today. It speaks to the question that Patrick raised around how, when trade doesn't benefit all fairly, it could lead to the kind of conflict and tension that we apparently are facing today. And it also speaks to the point that Jafar made earlier around the question of reform of the multilateral financial and economic system in particular, where without that access to finance, development finance, and affordable finance at that, as Patrick mentioned, it would be difficult to pursue, among others, one of the fundamental pillars for rebuilding trust in the multilateral system, which is achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We can't do that unless we are able to get development finance for Africa and the developing world, and do so at an affordable rate, and therefore without the reform of the multilateral financial system. Thank you very much for that again. I now move to the next speaker. My dear sister, I think our Dabo is online with us. I hope next time it would be here in Addis that we will host you in person. But it's really a pleasure to have you here with us. Awa is Director and Deputy Head of the United Nations Development Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. She is at the forefront of some of the cutting-edge discussions and reflections about peacebuilding and peacemaking, as well as the review, the 2025 review of the United Nations Peacebuilding Architecture Review. Awa, you are most welcome. And of course, as you take the floor, we would like your reflections on some of the questions, such as how is the UN adapting to the changes that we are witnessing the world over, particularly in terms of the role that you have and your office has with respect to peace building and conflict prevention strategies, as it relates to the work of the UN here in Africa in particular. And indeed, in what ways would the peacebuilding architecture review be anchored on and benefit from closer engagement and lessons learned from Africa's engagement in peace building, and indeed from the work of the African Union? Awa, once again, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Solomon, really. And yes, it's very sad I'm not in Addis. Of course, I would love to be there, but I was there just a month or so ago, and I couldn't really justify traveling all the way from New York. But really, it's a pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me and PBSO DPPA to this very interesting and important discussion. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, it is indeed a privilege to take part in this very important meeting, especially as we reflect on the evolving security dynamics of the African continent and the critical role multilateral institutions can play in fostering sustainable peace. This conversation could not be more timely, it could not be more essential. I mean, we need to clearly rethink our approaches to peace building and to conflict prevention in Africa, and ensuring that our strategies are both adaptive and that they're impactful. So the ongoing review of the peace-building architecture, the UN peace-building architecture, provides us with a unique opportunity for us to, in fact, do that. Africa's security landscape is undergoing profound changes. This is shaped by factors such as diverse factors, including climate change, violent extremism, the different governance transitions, and the very, very stark socioeconomic inequalities that we are seeing all across the continent. And these challenges demand that the United Nations recalibrate its peace-building strategies so we can remain effective and we can remain relevant. And in this context, let me share with you a few priorities that my office, which is the Peacebuilding Support Office of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, some of the priorities that we have indeed been carrying forward. Our first priority as far as peacebuilding prevention has been around national ownership and local approaches to peacebuilding. The UN has increasingly emphasized the importance of nationally owned prevention and peacebuilding strategies. And this is highlighted in the Secretary General's new Agenda for Peace, and is recognized by member states in the Pact for the Future. This approach prioritizes local ownership. It ensures that interventions are aligned with the specific needs of the communities rather than imposing, external frameworks and strategies. A second priority for us is about on youth engagement. And of course, with over 60% of Africa's population composed of young people, it's clear that we must invest in youth. Young people are not only digital natives, they are also agents of change who can drive economic development and can advocate for peace. So the UN needs to deepen its engagement with youth through initiatives that empower them to counter hate speech, for example, that promote social cohesion and that can contribute to sustainable development. And in this connection, I really want to welcome the request by member states for a second independent progress review on youth, which will be presented in mid next year. I also wish to thank the government of Burundi for having organized the first of its kind consultation on the study of the YPS within the margins of the AU summit in last February, a couple of months ago. Our third priority is around partnerships. Peacebuilding requires common efforts in support of national priorities. And this is why my office plays a key role within the UN system. The role we play is that we are the interface with the international financial institutions, with civil society organizations, and with regional organizations, particularly the African Union. And a fourth priority for us is around innovative financing. And this is to say that despite evidence that prevention does indeed yield significant returns on investments, peacebuilding remains severely underfunded. It is therefore important for us to explore innovative financing options for peacebuilding. The African Union Peace Fund does offer useful lessons on how to incentivize multinational development banks, such as the African Development Bank, for example, and as well as private sector, to help us to de-risk investments in conflict-affected countries. So these are the four priorities for DPPA PBSO. Now, Excellencies, the alignment of the UN's initiatives with the African regional mechanisms is therefore critical. We need to do this to enhance our peace building and sustaining peace efforts. The African Union, through the frameworks like the Agenda 2063 and the AU Post-Conflict Reconstruction and Development, does provide a robust foundation for collaboration. Additionally, the joint UN-AU framework for enhanced partnership in peace and security underscores the importance of institutionalizing collaboration between the two entities. This partnership between the AU and the UN has demonstrated success in addressing crises, such as in my country, the Gambia, post-electoral transition in 2016. And as the Gambia example has shown, A strong collaboration is essentially critical in moments of vulnerability, such as during difficult governance transitions. However, multilateral responses often fall short due to gaps in coordination, due to gaps in funding, and in inclusivity. And these fragmented approaches among international actors can often undermine efforts during governance transitions. So therefore, strengthening coordination between the UN Security Council, the AU Peace and Security Council, and the Peacebuilding Commission is essential for a unified action. But the lack of funding continues to remain a significant gap. And while initiatives like the Peacebuilding Fund, which we host, has supported Africa extensively, we have allocated 70% of our investments to the continent between 2020 and 2023. These funds are insufficient given the vast needs. So therefore, innovative financing models must be scaled up. Additionally, inclusivity is key. Women and youth remain underrepresented in governance transition processes, and this is despite their critical role in peace building. Multilateral responses must prioritize their participation to ensure inclusive governance systems that reflect diverse perspectives. Your Excellencies, the partnership between the UN and the AU has made significant progress, but requires further strengthening to ensure interventions are locally driven and that they're contextually relevant. The AU's expertise in grassroots mobilization complements the UN's global reach. Joint programs that integrate local knowledge with international resources can amplify impact. Many countries or many conflict-affected areas in Africa are marginalized from capitals and a lack of basic services. Joint intervention should prioritize these regions by fostering state presence, by delivering essential services, and by promoting social cohesion. And in this context, more regular consultation between the AU PSC and the Peacebuilding Commission, such as those that are held annually and have been held since 2017, do provide a platform for structured engagement. And I want to encourage a thorough discussion on how these consultative meetings can be institutionalized with a view to ensuring follow-up and actionable outcomes. My dear colleagues, several of these ideas can also be picked up within the context of the 2025 Peacebuilding Architecture Review. This Peacebuilding Architecture Review is happening at a critical time for the UN and for multilateralism. It provides an opportunity for all of us to recommit to the centrality of national ownership, of peace building, and of collective efforts to build lasting peace and development. As member states are about to embark on the formal negotiations of the PBAC, I wish to congratulate the African member states on the recent adoption by the PSC of the AU common position on the PBAC. Having the whole of the African continent behind some critical recommendations aimed at strengthening the work of the UN in peace building is critical. And I wish to encourage your active participation during the negotiations throughout this year. And in conclusion, let me just say that Africa's evolving security dynamics does require strategies that are adaptive and that are rooted in collaboration between global, regional, and local actors. By aligning with African mechanisms, addressing gaps in multilateral responses, and strengthening partnership between the UN and the AU, we can indeed pave the way for sustainable peace across the African continent. And as we move forward, let us reaffirm our commitment to invest in prevention, not just as a moral imperative, but as a strategic choice that yields long-term dividends for development and for stability. And together we can indeed ensure that Africa's role in peace building is not only recognized, but that it is empowered. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Awa, for your kind reflections, highlighting from the perspective of your office, the importance of local ownership, the inclusion of youth, and of course, partnerships. You also highlighted the fact that from the perspective of your office on peace building, Africa is a major terrain, both in terms of perfecting the tools and instruments of peace building, Africa being where much of the peace building interventions have been carried out since the establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission in 2005. And as you mentioned, during the past few years, 70% of the funds were also invested to support peace building needs here on the African continent. With respect to the Peacebuilding Architecture Review in 2025, indeed, this is a very unique time in so many ways, qualitatively different from the previous reviews of the Peacebuilding Architecture. And therefore, it provides a unique opportunity to reimagine and rethink in the face of these major challenges globally, but also importantly, as you put it, here on the African continent. Thank you so much once again for your reflections, and we look forward to continuous engagement as you continue on the journey of the Peacebuilding Architecture Review.
Thank you, sir.
I would like now to welcome another very good friend and brother, Itonde Kakoma, President of Interpeace. This is a non-governmental, non-state actor that now brings a great deal of wealth of knowledge and expertise, particularly as a result of years of experience on the ground through local peace building, Interpeace, here on the African continent, of course, in other parts of the world as well. Itonde, because I speak with you regularly, I thought that I might have seen you today in person, but here you are, virtually in Geneva. So wonderful to have you with us this afternoon, and thank you for making time to for all the role that you have been playing to connect Addis and Geneva as well. I would like you to reflect on a few of the following questions. How can peacebuilding approach rooted in local knowledge and community engagement be more effectively integrated into regional and, of course, global conflict resolution and peacebuilding strategies and processes? How can Geneva-based peacebuilding organizations, such as Interpeace, collaborate with the African Union and regional bodies to enhance local ownership of peace processes? Itonde, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, dear brother. Tanastalin to all in Addis Ababa. I'm Solomon, your moderator. I must say I'm filled with mixed emotions, knowing that you and so many dear friends are physically in the room, but you exude the spirit of the gathering. So I trust that Awa and I, and together with our dear brother Patrick, we feel it here, even if in hybrid form. Let me extend greetings, as I'm sure my dear colleagues have, from Geneva. Here, a sister city of committed to multilateral diplomacy, as is New York and Addis Ababa, the three together amongst several others, but I think distinctly the three have a historic legacy that should be studied and furthered, particularly in the state of the world we are in. Let me also say that in the context of this meeting, we are feeling the effects of the shifting state of multilateralism and the commitment to it. But the public story perhaps doesn't reflect the reality that my dear sister was alluding to, and the ongoing efforts that carry on despite some of the very serious changes, if not setbacks, that we are all experiencing. And Geneva is not short of that experience. And I trust time will allow us to reflect upon the implications of the state of the world and what it means for effective peace building centered in multilateral structures. Having said that, Awa, not to flatter you, but I can ascribe to everything you said, and in fact can do away with half of my intervention as a result. Dear colleagues, let me also add this, that as we're reflecting upon the state of the world and its implications for more effective peace building, I think it's important for us also to put in the context this seismic shift happening, akin to the era in which the organization I'm privileged to lead came into existence 30 some odd years ago now. And that is at the cusp or end, if you will, of the Cold War. And why I mention that, Solomon and colleagues, is because at that moment, through the leadership of the United Nations, the African Union, and other major multilateral cooperation fora, there was an articulation of a quote, an agenda for peace being laid out in light of the state of the world then, and a promise of cooperation based on what was occurring in broader context. And the tenets for that vision really were stipulated by a vision not only of a post-conflict development model, but one that was rooted in a commitment to peace building and undergirded by a readiness to embark upon, quote, comprehensive peace settlements. Please don't get me wrong. We know that while that period marked great promise for some, it was also marred by serious atrocities in various parts of the world, particularly post-colonial states. And we could look at that vis-a-vis the presence of widespread international and non-international, particular armed conflicts from the Balkans to the Great Lakes to Southeast Asia and Central America. As we are convening, we know that one member state, not only of the United Nations, but that of the African Union, is marking precisely 31 years since the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, precisely the time period in which organizations such as ourselves and many others come into existence. At that time, Interpeace as a project and vision of the UN system itself was described as the war-torn society's project, trying to grapple with the changing nature of conflict at that moment. The challenge is this: we have an eerie or haunting sense of returning to the era or the period of our founding, but the nature of conflict and the mechanisms to resolve them in a sustainable manner are changing drastically. Hence the emphasis you've heard from Patrick and Awa on innovative solutions. I think it's crucial, and not only because we're sitting here in Geneva and literally looking across the hill to where the protected emblem of Red Cross and Red Crescent are held there as custodians of ICRC, but the president of ICRC speaks of the highest number of conflicts documented within their history of documenting armed conflicts, more than a century. And the calculation at present is somewhere around 120 active armed conflicts. The challenge with that number is that only a few of them are on the headline, 5 or so. So what then of the other 115? That speaks to a broader challenge of how we sustain attention amidst rising instability, rising conflict, which gets to the core of your question, but it is painting a picture of increased volatility. Coupled by a decreasing investment in the very things that we have known over these 3 decades or so and longer that make for more durable peace through a development portfolio. Now, we can talk about the problems of that approach and dependency that result referred to a lot more on inclusion and inclusive, but also fundamentally about what we know to be true, dear colleagues, is that peace agreement that is squarely or singularly focused on an elite settlement, particularly focused on men and men with guns, will not last. We are simply delaying the inevitable returning of cycles of violence if the broader inclusion is not simply also best practice towards more sustainable peace that leads to ownership, and furthermore, on time horizon. And while we are struggling with so many changes taking place globally, this shouldn't do away with the ability to not only, yes, concentrate on bringing an end to the immediacy and impact of conflicts, but with a time horizon that takes into account the intergenerational consequences as well as opportunities of conflict. And the emphasis that my dear colleague referred to, in which we share on youth, peace and security, again, is not simply a value proposition alone. It's important as one. It is fundamental because sustainable peace is ultimately an intergenerational challenge, which necessarily requires the involvement, substantive involvement of youth. Now, final point on Geneva and Addis.
Yes, thank
Without
you.
exclusion. Thank you, Solomon. Without exclusion to New York by any means. But on Geneva and Addis, as this is a moment of meeting, if you will, I would refer to a critical moment in history. And when you come to Geneva next, Solomon, I hope we can journey to the archives of the League of Nations, housed
Can you hear me?
now we can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for reminding us, for us to be audible for the online audience as well. I was saying you have been very thoughtful and also very ambitious and ideal in your reflections, particularly in reminding us that given the number of conflicts that the world is dealing with at this point in time, the ones that receive much of the attention will not be more than a handful. The rest, what happens to the rest? And with that question, of course, comes the role that your organization, Interpeace, plays. Because your organization plays peace building and carries out those activities, not necessarily in those 5 handful that take much of the headline, but in those remaining many others that do not receive the headline. Your proposition to flatly reject the idea or the conclusion that analysts have reached at, that the time for comprehensive peace agreements is over, is the one that I found to be ideal. But I understood why you said what you said. Actually, what the world needs is not less peace. less comprehensive peace. What the world needs is more comprehensive peace, but that goes beyond and above the pact between elites. One that actually goes deeper and brings the local, brings the communities, women and youth into the forefront of peace agreements. There is a lot to unpack in this, but we don't have time, so I will quickly move to our next speaker, Your Excellency Ambassador Natalie Schward. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrongly. The director of DICHAV, Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, who also played a role in the establishment of the Geneva Peacebuilding platform, as I learned earlier on. You are most welcome. Really great to have you with us. Please. I will not ask the questions in the interest of time.
It's not me. Okay. Should I start in the dark?
Maybe for just for a couple of seconds.
Colleagues online?
For our colleagues online, so that I understand that they must have a stand-on generator that would kick in. Yeah.
Okay, let's go. Yeah, I hope that our colleagues online are also still there. Good afternoon, everyone. I will also try to be as short as possible. It's always difficult to be the last panelist because so many things have already been said, but I think we hopefully bring some specificities when it comes to the security sector. But I want really to thank first the GPP and Amani Africa and my Swiss colleagues from bringing us to Addis. I think it's an important kind of step. I was part of this iteration to New York, and I'm very happy to be also part of this gathering in Addis today. For those who are not familiar with DCAF, the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, this is an organization based in Geneva, obviously, that is now 25 years old, and that has really, since the beginning, worked to improve the security of the people and the state within this framework of human rights, good governance, the rule of law, and really bringing a lot of expertise to the discussion. And we do recognize that at DCAF that an accountable, effective, and inclusive security sector is really key in reducing the risk of violence and creating a fertile environment for sustainable development. And we have already spoken quite a lot this afternoon about the need for this sustainable development. And I do really think that this discussion today in Africa are not only important, but timely, as many of the colleagues have said, but really also bring the focus on so many dimensions that are part of this discussion. And many African countries today face fragility at many different levels. I mean, political, societal, economic, environmental, and security. And really these overlapping kind of fragilities in their sustainable development. And we know that fragility is certainly context relevant. But that said, we also know that poorly governed institution and security institution, when it comes to my reflection today, can really worsen this fragility. And weak, unaccountable or predatory security institutions are often creating or participating to the condition that spark violence and instability. And this is really a vicious circle. So security sector governance is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And without it, we are not just managing instability, we are fueling it. So we heard numerous times already today that we live in an increasingly multipolar world where challenges are growing, where conflicts are increasing, and resources for development are diminishing. Very often, we have a tendency to focus too narrowly on security at the expense of development. And today we see that defense spending is reaching a world record for the 9th year in a row, but we also see a record low this time for amounts going to the security governance. So for DCAF, I mean, we also think that that should not be the case. And we need to continue really voicing that investing in the governance of the security sector is relevant and that this contribute to development globally, but for sure also on this continent and really for the benefit of the states and the people. And that is really the virtuous circle this time. So security sector governance has a particular value because we think it can bridge really security and development actors, and that effective, accountable and inclusive institution not only prevent conflict, they foster a stable environment for sustainable economic growth and that uphold the rule of law and human rights, and that then underpin broader societal and development goals. So more concretely, and I think it's an important point in today's world, investing in governance contributes to protect the substantial investment in security that have been made over the years, especially in contexts with high and extreme fragility. So at DCAF, we are committed to promote this all of government and people-centered approach to security and to integrate this different perspective into the policy making, which is really important if we want to understand and really resolve the complex challenges that are there in front of us. So obviously all that takes time and political leadership. And there are perhaps 5 points that I wanted to highlight when it comes to this parameter that can support our action. The first point is about the political processes. Security sector reform are highly political processes. They are not just technical undertakings. And therefore, prioritizing governance is essential for achieving sustainable results and fostering genuine national ownership. So there are really numerous examples where purely technical approaches have yielded only limited or short-lived results. And when the focus is only on structural or operational changes without addressing these political, social, and cultural dynamics, the reforms risk not only to face institutional resistance, but also public distrust. And we spoke a lot about the trust this afternoon, or unintended consequences. So this genuine political commitment is really essential for meaningful and sustainable security sector governance, but also for long-term changes. And these journeys, when they are like kind of taken at the national level, need really to be supported because also it needs to trigger an impact and respond to the needs of the population. The second point is about how security sector governance should be better integrated with national priorities. And there are always many national priorities, but in the current climate, it's important that security sector governance is seen as an enabler of sustainable progress on issues such as we heard earlier, development, peace building, prevention of conflict, irregular migration, or counter-terrorism. It's not only a standalone technical exercise. So that means again that this effort should be grounded in an inclusive vision that is connected with other national agenda and priorities that are owned by national stakeholders. And at that level, the African Union is ideally placed to provide meaningful support, first through its security sector reform policy framework and related guidance, but also as conveners. We know that regional and sub-regional organizations are fantastic conveners, and having this discussion on good practices, on standards, is really crucial also to allow and contribute to national ownership. A lot of things has been already said about my third point, that's about being an actor of international Geneva. You've seen DCAF is not the only actor in Geneva, but I think that's important still to say that all these actors are really part of an ecosystem that is really a collaborative ecosystem in Geneva. It's really a hub for peace building, for human rights, for prevention, and it has value not only for what happens in Geneva, but it has values for how we connect peace building efforts globally. And I think this event is also a testimony to that. And what we really try to do at DCAF is to bring these voices from the field to important discussion. And that has been the case, for instance, when it comes to Somalia, where DCAF has supported the development of national capacity to plan and budget the security sector development prior to its presentation to the international community in New York in December 2023. And we also brought the discussion to the Geneva Peace Week last year. So I think that's important to say that these efforts have helped shift the dialogue from a narrow focus on fourth generation to broader consideration on affordability and the long-term sustainability of Somali security sector capabilities. So generally speaking, the issue of budgeting is absolutely crucial because it also tells a lot about where countries and states are putting their priorities, and therefore that's also an element that we should keep really at the heart of our consideration. Now, perhaps to say that all these discussions are obviously crucial because they are nourished at the multilateral level from the experiences and the realities of the actors on the ground with their challenges and really the opportunities. So that also needs to be taken into consideration. We heard so much about inclusivity in the previous intervention, so I will not add too much. For sure, for us, it's absolutely the same that the inclusion of all communities is really central. We spoke about the youth, we spoke about the women, but all groups in vulnerable situation is really important, not only to have in the discussions, but also having an equal access to really being part of the sector, and in this case, the security sector. And here I wanted to make a quick point on the participation of the women, because it's not only about having only participation of women in the security sector. We know that this going in the right direction, but it's really having this meaningful participation of the women so that they are really visible for the rest of the community, so that it can really also contribute to the legitimacy and the efficiency of the security sector. So that brings also the point of the civil society. And I think we haven't spoken that much about that this afternoon, but that's also important to say that we need to create more and more space for having this dialogue between authorities, civil societies, and the private sector as well. In our field of expertise, for sure, to create this vision around the security, but I think in many of the other elements that were discussed this afternoon. And again, it's not having a platform for having a platform. It's having a platform really and contributing and supporting the civil society in being there with a meaningful participation. My last point, and I think it's crucial in today's world, is about accountability. So that means really the importance of the civilian oversight of the security sector. So today, and we heard that again this afternoon, states are increasingly tempted to resort to traditional hard security. And at this particular time, strengthening accountability is crucial, as weak oversight allows abuse of powers, corruption, and impunity. And accountability is not only key to prevent misuse and corruption today, it also ensures that spending reflects real security needs, but also, and it is crucial today again, enhance and maintain public trust. And here I want to say that for sure there is a focus that needs to be made in accountability, not only on all the issues, but really to focus on the issues that are important for the population. I have two last points, perhaps to say that accountability, and I want to bring it perhaps to the multilateral organization, accountability is absolutely central at the national level, but also here sub-regional and regional organizations can really play a crucial role in supporting the standard setting. And I think that's absolutely central. Perhaps to say that, as you have heard, I mean, without democratic governance of the security sector, there is the risk that society remains vulnerable to cycle of instability, human rights violation, and economic stagnation. That can be reversed, and we do think that a security sector that is accountable, inclusive, transparent, and efficient is really also the foundation for lasting peace and human security and sustainable development.
Thank you very much. I have to apologize to you. it sounded a little bit short, but I actually wanted to let you go on. It's just that we are left with very little time before the next panel, but it would be remiss of me if we do not give the floor to participants. I will take a few interventions before we wrap up in order to transition to the next panel, of which Ambassador George, PR of Kenya to the AU, is already here. Thank you, Ambassador, for coming. Let me start with you, please. Most welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you
If
very
you
much.
start with introducing yourself and also your affiliation.
Okay, my name is Hamid Nuru. I'm with the World Food Programme and the representative to the African Union. My previous life, I've been in many hotspot situations like country director in Sudan and other places like that. This is a very wonderful and engaging platform here. But I really think that at the end of the day, we have to say, what can this platform do in practical terms to turn the tide of conflicts, especially in Africa? You know, we know that when you have conflicts do not happen in isolation. They don't happen overnight. We know that they're about to happen. What do we do and where do we concentrate to prevent these things from happening? Early warning systems was mentioned here. We can give you all the information you want, but if you don't make the decision on time, you are going to get into conflict. And whenever you start conflict, it always goes down a rabbit hole. It affects education, it affects health, it affects children, it affects, you know, and it's always worse off at the end. So what do we do at this platform to concentrate on those areas that we need to make significant? I'm sorry, announcing that we condemn in the strongest possible word from the United Nations or from the African Union that is not cutting the mustard on the ground. We need to concentrate on certain areas. Conflicts are fueled by weapons. Those are the tools of conflicts. It's weapons. If those weapons are moderated or you can stop that from happening, it's the same thing with food. I come from a food background. If you don't want malnutrition, you feed now. If you don't want starvation, you feed now. If you don't want hunger, you put food on the table. You stop conflicts by stopping weapons. How do those weapons come in? Where do they come from? That's where we need to concentrate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. So something pragmatic, practical that this platform is going to do. I saw the hand of Hillary from the ICRC.
Thank you so much, Dr. Solomon, for this chance. My name is Hilary Kiboro, Deputy Head of Delegation of the ICRC Delegation to the African Union. I have a very simple question, could be answered by any of the panelists. And I'm looking at peace and the process of peace building and the toolbox that we have for peace building. And one of them is international humanitarian law and humanitarian action. And what I want to ask is, in confidence building, you need a process to build trust among the parties that are warring before you get to peace. And one of the tools that you can use is IHL and humanitarian action. But we also see more and more that humanitarian action is instrumentalized for political purposes, or it's used as a tool for negotiating power. So how do you ensure that you have this tool that you use to build peace, towards peace, you use it for confidence building, but yet it doesn't go the slippery road of being used for negotiating political power or for negotiating other things. And that is a very key issue that I want to draw the connection between international humanitarian law and peace building efforts. So and I think Dr. Itonde could be very well placed to answer that question. Thank you.
Itonde, your name has been mentioned. I hope you are alive and listening. I will take a third one. If it is from a lady, that would be my preference. Ladies, come on, don't let me down. Aye. You don't have any question? You don't have any reflection on the discussions that we have been having? Okay, I will not force it on you. Okay, a young person. I'll give a young person here in front. Quickly, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This is Brooke Ascialo from Andaras Youth Association. It's a quite interesting panel to learn from you, from our elders, but always what make me to question is users has not to be used as some participatory on a project that's made out, because we are the cause and also the effect on the conflicts and peace also, which happen in Africa and other places. So what's the real tangible way that our voice is heard and be inclusive in terms of not hearing a voice, but practical project implementation? Thank you.
That's a very precise question. Let me come back to you, distinguished members of the panel. The first question, what is it that we need to do practically in order to turn the tide against the large number of conflicts that we are confronted with today, practically? And the second question about one of the challenges of today from the perspective of IHL, which is making humanitarian access negotiable, making the non-negotiable negotiable. That is the kind of situation that we have confronted with in some of the conflict situations in the world, here in this region as well. And of course, practically speaking, again, the third question on youth inclusion, particularly in project design and implementation as well. So who would like to start? Please. Thank you.
Thank you, Solomon. Now I will try to start briefly to come up with some thoughts on at least the first, let's say, the first two questions. I think that stopping conflicts by stopping weapons circulation is of course key, and but not enough. I think this is what we try to focus on in Geneva, and I think elsewhere is, and you mentioned it yourself, is the word prevention. And everything we talked about here today is really about enhancing prevention by regulating the security sector, by also regulating weapons circulation through the Arms Trade Treaty or through other means. But as you also said, we are now facing very complicated times in terms of policy, and we can witness what is happening in the face of the war, for example, between Ukraine and Russia, where some states who were party to the treaty banning anti-personnel weapons are now considering withdrawing from it, or at least using anti-personnel mines, which are one of the weapons that the majority of states were agreeing on prohibiting. So we are facing now a withdrawal from basic principles, and this is very worrying. So I think that your call for action is so key, but states today are stepping backward to what should be needed, and we need action, and perhaps states are not doing their word, but peace builders on the ground, activists, different international organizations need to remind how important these principles are in terms of prevention, preventing human rights violations, preventing the circulations of weapons, preventing the fact that we are facing food shortages, starvations, and so on and so forth. A small word about IHL, because this is also something which is key to my heart. We are also witnessing a step back in IHL respect, and you mentioned humanitarian access, and what we witness here today in Gaza, for example, but also in other conflicts in the world, is so worrisome that it's difficult to find hope in what we are seeing. And I think even if it's not, let's say, hearable for many states, I think the key issues here is accountability. And you mentioned accountability, of course, at the local level, but we need to remind that gross human rights and IHL violations, and also not respecting certain key norms of IHL, are war crimes, are crimes that need to be punished, that need to be brought before the International Criminal Court by, and especially when these are done by leaders that have ordered the commission of these crimes. And I know this is not politically hearable for many states, but it's the reality. And as long as there is this shyness from reminding that IHL must be respected in times of armed conflict, we will face a slippery slope towards conflicts that are becoming more and more harsh on the civilians, on the people that are living day to day in these horrific circumstances. So these are two things that I wanted to say, but I don't know if you want to add something.
Thank you. So I think on accountability, you said it all. And I think once again, it's not only accountability at the local level where, I mean, the population, the society, the civil society has also some really role to play in also countering some of the narratives, but also at the sub-regional, regional and international level. Perhaps just on the issue of arms, and you said it as well, I mean, defense, it's not enough to stop like proliferation of weapons. We are living in a world where like some kinds of security perspectives are kind of brought to all sorts of problems, and we tend to see the issues through the security lens. But I think I said that earlier, I mean, fragility is very much context relevant. So resilience is also context specific. And I think we should also look at these broader kind of transnational issues, but also looking at the problem from a very kind of specific perspective that really responds to the population needs and really makes a difference for the population in a particular place. And I mean, for sure, preventing arrival of guns is extremely important, but to have institutions that are accountable in general is also crucial. To have economic perspective is also crucial, and other issues there. On the youth inclusion, thank you for pushing us on that. And I think from our perspective, we really try to involve as much as possible the youth and having these groups that can contribute to bringing their perspective on the situation and really their responses as well, and how they see what kind of vision they have for the security in their particular context. But happy to discuss with you if there are some more ideas of having you actively really engage in those things. For DCAF, we work mostly in the security sector. So that means mostly with the army, with the policemen. So that means in general with adults and grown-up people. But I think once again, in this accountability kind of discussion and providing your perspective, you have a serious role to play.
Yeah, please, Ambassador Petro, before I come to you, Itonde online.
Yeah, no, very briefly. I mean, Hamid, you put us a little bit on the spot. I mean, to be honest, this platform will not end the conflict in Sudan tomorrow or the conflict in the DRC tomorrow. And I'm putting you back on the spot in the sense that this wasn't what you were claiming that we should do. But I think the question is pertinent in the sense of revisiting exactly what the initial idea is of bringing the two hubs of Addis and Geneva together. And I think that's where I think we can plant at least a seed that leads us towards a more mature discussion on how we better use the instruments that are now faltering in preventing conflicts, and then also what Itonde very eloquently presented, also how to ensure that there is a sustaining peace. And I think you put it in a provocative way also with regard to if somebody is hungry, you put food on the table. Indeed, but I mean, the next step is then also to make sure that he has education, and that he has access to social security, and the family is taken care of. So there is also all these elements, and I think this is where I see the particular interest of bringing Addis closer to Geneva and vice versa, in being able to bring together these actors, to be better equipped to address the question of how we sustain peace and how we prevent conflict and how we address post-conflict reconstructions and development. Because the added values, we have instruments in Addis, we have instruments in Geneva and elsewhere, but we don't necessarily bring them together often enough. On IHL, I think it was a perfect pitch for the event tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. So if you're, or 10:30, something like that. So if you're interested to have a much more elaborate, much more insightful answer to the question that Hillary raised today, come back tomorrow morning. It's a fantastic panel where this question will be raised. And on youth engagement, I can't not mention a project that is very close to my heart. It's a small one. It's not, at least for, yeah, I think it's a small project, but I hope it has a major impact. Last year, together with the 5 fantastic African youth ambassadors for peace, they organized regional consultations and continental consultations, and drafted, in my view, a fantastic comment on sort of African youth commenting the Secretary Generals of the UN's new agenda for peace. So you have this almost elusive figure of the Secretary General with his team drafting his vision on what a new agenda for peace should be. And now you have an incredible thought through, elaborated, consolidated response by the African youth, led by these fantastic 5 young people from the 5 regions of Africa. And I thought that was a fantastic document. There is a colleague here from the EU Commission who was pinnacle in putting this together. And it was absolutely fantastic to bring the 5 youth ambassadors to New York when the AUPSC met with the UN Security Council, and they briefed the 2 councils on their work as well as on the report. And that was done, sorry to say, it's flattering a little bit my own country, but it was done during the Swiss presidency of the UN Security Council in cooperation with the Egyptian chairmanship of the AUPSC. So one small example, just an inspirational one. I think Africa is also here on YPS, leading the way with the African Youth Ambassadors for Peace, now with the Wise Youth Network, and really a myriad of grassroots organizations led by young people really making a difference. And it's something that we have to benefit more. We have to include you more and really put you also at the table for, again, making sure that the peace that is negotiated is sustained with through your involvement. Thanks, Solomon.
Thank you so much. Itonde, over to you, please. I see Addis behind you.
That is true. Look, let me, I think the first question by my dear friend and brother, Noor Hamid, as well as the second question from the Deputy Representative Vice CRC, are totally interlinked. That is to say, the manner in which wars or the conduct of hostilities are being carried out have direct bearing on the possibility, if not quality, of peace being sought therein and thereafter. Meaning that the conduct of hostilities and their adherence or non-adherence to not only international humanitarian law, but also other forms and other bodies of international law at the nexus of IHL, from humanitarian law to criminal law, as colleagues have alluded to, have direct consequences on the quality of peace being sought. But similarly, because we know that there is a lack of or diminishing adherence to IHL in the conduct of hostilities, we're seeing wars and armed conflict not only lasting longer, but being more destructive, with entire city centers, communities being destroyed. This means that the reconstruction agenda, which I know is close to the heart of the AU system, becomes much more challenging. So in the same way that the manner in which wars are being carried out has consequences for the quality of peace thereafter. Similarly, the processes by which reconstruction is advanced has implications or direct correlation to whether or not you can sustain a peace agenda. And putting a human as well as ecological center around both peace processes and reconstruction processes are fundamental to getting that right. And I have to commend the leadership of ICRC and the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement writ large for putting at the center of humanitarian diplomacy, not only in Geneva, but globally, on those interlinkages between IHL and peace, and more broadly, between humanitarian diplomacy and peace. If I can say one final message here, that humanitarians in particular, we speak of WFP and other such institutions, are feeling much more pressure at present to do the work of quote unquote peacemakers and peace builders. And that has a lot to do with the shrinking of political and diplomatic space in the advancement of peace. This is a dangerous trend because we also have to preserve the impartiality, neutrality of humanitarian actors in the universal delivery of those services. And this is a challenge not just for institutions based in Geneva, but also for the African Union that is really asserting itself in the humanitarian diplomacy agenda, but doing so that upholds certain fundamentals in humanitarian action. So thank you, Solomon, for allowing me to take the floor again.
Thank you very much, Tonde. Ladies and gentlemen, we started with Ambassador Petro's address with a quote from Charles Dickens. The best of times and the worst of times, spring of hope and the winter of despair. We could have actually started differently as well, right? And maybe I would like to end with another quote that would actually resonate with this moment. And this is from Antonio Gramsci. Reflecting on the time of another profound shift in the world at his time, he said the following: "The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." End of quote. The deep reflections that we heard from all the speakers made reference to this moment as a moment of challenge, a moment of tectonic shifts. This moment as a moment that requires resetting, rethinking, reaffirming trust and faith in the multilateral system. We have therefore to necessarily contend with the gravity and scale of what is unfolding. Because without us paying attention and having our eyes on these major shifts, changes, and challenges, and if we continue in the business as usual fashion, we may find ourselves in a place that would be unimaginable. That is why this focus on these major trends and shifts, whether it is in terms of the number of conflicts or in terms of reference was made to trade wars earlier on, or in terms of the challenge to fundamental principles of the UN Charter on which the multilateral system is built, or on IHL and humanitarian access, which is critical for maintaining a modicum of common ground on which to build a more sustainable peace. On any of these challenges, we need to think about the question of whether or not reform is enough, and what kind of reform, if reform is enough. And if it is true that the script that has been written in 1945 is no longer applicable and therefore outdated, what would be the new script? And who would be writing that new script? But we shouldn't just get lost in that. There is the here and now that we have to deal with. And these reflections also provided us with enough thoughts, enough food for thought in terms of what we need to do on the here and now, in terms of responding to the needs of people who are caught up in the crossfire of 120 conflicts worldwide, many of them here on the African continent. What is it that needs to be done is the question that has been posed. And of course, there are things that can be and need to be done, many of them shared here. States have responsibilities, and there is a need to put emphasis on and calling out on them, and indeed making them to restore their commitment and compliance with the rules that they themselves have written, nobody else. And of course, this world, the time that we are in, is not just a world of states as well. The role of civil society have been mentioned. The role of local actors, women and youth, have been mentioned. And the role, most of all, that we haven't talked enough about, of private actors. The emergence of a world of oligarchy and what that means for us, for the international system. But specifically, I think those questions of bringing Addis and Geneva and the expertise and knowledge, as well as institutional and normative capacities of these multilateral hubs, is critical both in engaging on the bigger, more challenging issues, but also on the now and immediate questions of peace and security, protection of civilians, responding to climate change. Speaking of climate change, we now move immediately. For those of you online and here, please don't leave. We will be shifting right away to the peace talk, which would have a focus on one of the most profound challenges facing humanity, which, as Pietro mentioned, manifests itself in a more catastrophic ways and consequences here on the African continent, despite the fact that Africa contributed the least. And we have panelists who would be sharing with us their reflections on that. I would like to, once again, we will be back with a 10-minute break. Once again, please join me in thanking this incredible conversation and members of the panel who have helped us to have this